The Six-Day War in Egypt. Project by Chad Goodrich. Before I get into the deep analysis of the contents of this particular topic, I'd like to briefly mention the importance of Charles Tilly's assessment of war in the 20th century. Some of the dramatic changes in violence across the 20th century had little to do with independent conflicts and everything to do with domestic disputes in foreign territories. The backing of great powers had enabled existing rulers to consolidate their control on government structures and use it for their own personal gain. In their quest for power and control, civil wars became more prominent. No doubt, arming and provoking rebellions resulted in violent conflicts throughout, all in the name of nationalism. But for now, this is the tale of the Six-Day War. Escalating tensions. The origins of the Six-Day War dates back to the late 1960s. A brief skirmish that was fought between June 5th and June 10th of 1967 by Israel and the neighboring states of Egypt. The neighboring states were known then as the United Arab Republic, also known as the UAR, where Jordan, along with Syria, included both long-standing and immediate issues that led into conflict. During the period of the Six-Day War, the earlier foundation of Israel, along with the incoming Palestinian refugee issues, and Israel's involvement in the invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis of 1956, continued to be significant grievances for the Arab world. The actions of the Arab nationalists, led by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, continued to be hostile to Israel's existence and made threatening remarks against the Jewish population. By the mid-1960s, relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors had deteriorated to the extent that a number of border clashes had taken place in its stead. Israel consistently expressed a desire to negotiate with its neighbors. In an address to the UN General Assembly on October 10, 1960, Foreign Minister Golda Meir challenged Arab leaders to meet with Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to negotiate a peace settlement. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser answered on October 15, saying that Israel was trying to deceive world opinion and reiterating that his country would never recognize the Jewish state. The Arabs were equally adamant in their refusal to negotiate a separate settlement for the refugees. As Nasser told the United Arab Republic National Assembly on March 26, 1964, quote, "Israel and the imperialism around us, which confront us, are two separate things. There have been attempts to separate them in order to break up the problems and present them in an imaginary light as if the problem of Israel is the problem of the refugees, by the solution of which the problem of Palestine will also be solved, and no residue of the problem will remain. The danger of Israel lies in the very existence of Israel, as it is in the present and in what she represents." End quote. A decisive victory. While most units were fighting the Egyptians and Jordanians, a small group of soldiers were left to defend the northern border against the Syrians. It was not until the Jordanians and the Egyptians were subdued that reinforcements could be sent to the Golan Heights, where Syrian gunners commanding the strategic high ground made it exceedingly difficult and costly for Israeli forces to penetrate. Finally, on June 9th, after 2 days of heavy bombardment, Israeli forces succeeded in breaking through the Syrian line. After just 6 days of fighting, Israeli forces were in a position to march in Cairo, Damascus, and Amman. By this time, the principal objectives of capturing the Sinai and the Golan Heights had been accomplished, and Israeli political leaders had no desire to fight in the Arab capitals. Furthermore, the Soviet Union had become increasingly alarmed by the Israeli advances and was threatening to intervene. At this point, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Rusk advised the Israelis in the strongest possible terms to upset a ceasefire. On June 10th, Israel did just that. The victory came at a very high cost. In storming the Golan Heights, Israel suffered 115 dead, roughly the number of Americans killed during Operation Desert Storm. Altogether, Israel lost twice as many men, 777 dead, and 2,586 wounded, in proportion to her total population as the U.S. lost in 8 years of fighting in Vietnam. Also, despite the incredible success of the air campaign, the Israeli Air Force lost 46 of its 200 fighters. The death toll on the Arab side was 15,000, Egyptians 2,500, Syrians, and 800 Jordanians. By the end of the war, Israel had conquered enough territory to more than triple the size of the area it controlled. From 8,000 to 26,000 square miles, the victory enabled Israel to unify Jerusalem. Israeli forces had also captured the Sinai, Golan Heights, Gaza Strip, and West Bank. In retrospect to the readings over the semester, Chris Hedges' book gives abundant resources, personal perspectives, and analysis on why the act of war primarily persists in times of crisis. Hedges shows us that war gives us meaning through a bunch of multifaceted examples in his personal accounts, but perhaps the one that applies most to this particular event of my choosing has to do fundamentally with nationalist attitudes and ideologies as well as triumphalism in wartime. For example, in his personal account of his time in Argentina, the populist perception of the dirty war that took place through the 70s and early 80s was almost unifiable. He, Chris Hedges, was curious as to why a nation calling for change would rather form militaristic killers. Here, I believe his assessment of society's deep and passionate yearning for a nationalist cause that exalts us is well within the bounds for what we validate as meaning. In what he describes as a yearning that only war can deliver, I can't help but think a bit cynically about his assessment, mainly because there's legitimate truth to it in regards to Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. At the core of Nasser's motivations, he, like millions of others occupying Arab-Israeli territories, was a militant nationalist, willing to sacrifice the lives of thousands and perhaps millions to ensure that Arab rule in the territory was not undermined by Israeli forces and ideologies. Essentially, it is the culmination of pride, uniformity, and security that gives credence to the provocation of war and the perception that usually follows during the afterthought. Hedges makes a bold and haunting statement that we abandon individual responsibility for a shared, unquestioned communal enterprise, however morally dubious. In closing, as we look back on a time in the Middle East that was ruined with constant conflict and aggression, and still is to this day, we'll begin to understand why the conflict between Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and essentially the majority of the Arab territories and Israeli forces happened in the first place. At the root of it all is the concept of nationalism intertwined with political upheaval, thirst for power, and territorial disputes. When you peel back the superficial layers of the reason for the war happening, it seems that Hedges' original assessment of unifying and communal belonging isn't far off track from the research I've gathered and concluded with the information I've been given. Nationalism played a significant role in the Six-Day War. According to the information, the preceding war only accelerated due to Egypt's president's decision to react to Israel's expansion and Israel's claim that Egypt had attacked them. As we can see from both accounts, nationalism distorts and manipulates history by being biased and neglecting facts in favor of opinions and/or beliefs. Had the Arab territories been more aware of Israel's quest for expansion before the initial war began, who knows how much of history would have changed. But as far as historians could tell, the prevailing view is that although Israel struck first, the Israeli strike was defensive at its core. Perhaps entities like the UN and USSR would have been more willing and open to defensive measures and anti-war sentiments that could theoretically de-escalate the situation before tensions rose. As a reference to earlier semester discussions and readings, I'd like to reiterate that nationalism becomes poisonous when either country's refusal to acknowledge shortcomings and actions in the name of nationalism only serve more discomfort and turmoil. And in the case of the Six-Day War, Egypt and its allies learned this the hard way.